Hello! Good evening! Death! Monster Hunter Wilds is on the horizon, or rather the horizon of the horizon, and I wanted to talk about this series' traversal and exploration and what these new bigger areas might mean for it. But Jabu, that game was announced 3 months ago. Why are you just talking about it now? I make videos so inconsistently as is, I hope none of my 7 subscribers expected me to be first to the punch for this, but even if one of you did, I promise the conversation I want to have here is a unique enough one to justify the 3-month wait. But before I even get into this topic, I want to make it very clear that I don't know everything, so let's establish what I do know. So, this is my presentation. Let's get into it. These are the games I've played. So yeah, I haven't been with the series since the beginning, but I've played every mainline Monster Hunter game released in the last decade, meaning that I've been able to observe trends in the series' game design. I don't think Capcom gets enough credit for Monster Hunter's level design. In every Monster Hunter game, the maps correspond perfectly to the function and limitations of their game. It can just be a little hard to tell in some of the older ones. Cause I know you're probably a modern man with modern sensibilities, and as soon as you heard about these 3DS games with loading screens between areas, you were immediately turned off from them. But I promise you, it is not as boring as it sounds. Just gotta wait for it. Yep. Alright, here we go. Just wait for it. Just wait. That's peak fiction! What's so beautiful about zone-based maps is that each one has its own distinct purpose and placement. They were obviously the big open areas where you would duke it out with monsters, but maybe the zone below it is a thin corridor where monster fights suddenly become a lot more dangerous. Maybe the zone above it is a small, feline enclave that large monsters can't enter. And even within the confines of these segmented maps, we were still able to see notable design changes to accommodate new hunter actions, like in 4 Ultimate, my first Monster Hunter game, where they added ledges to properly allow for the new mounting mechanic. And this trend sorta continued forward into Monster Hunter World, which introduced slopes and sliding attacks. Moving through maps in that game is a real treat because you get to watch all this endemic life move about, and you see points of interest via unexplored areas of the map, items, monster tracks, and, the works. So all that's great, but I have to admit that even in my favorite Monster Hunter games, traversing the map itself isn't always the most interesting thing in the world. But to properly make this point, I need to talk about a very, very different game. There's a point to this, I promise. I feel like I say that a lot. Spider-Man 2 is obviously very different from any Monster Hunter game, and that's in no small part due to the game's movement. They had it down great in the PS4 game, and while I have my gripes with Spider-Man 2, they really perfected the web slinging in this one, if nothing else. They got that right. And that's because of the new emphasis on physics-based momentum. As fun as the swinging was in the previous 2 games, as long as you kept using R2, you'd be good and you wouldn't have to think too hard. But in this game, by giving us the option to turn down assistance or turn it off completely, as well as the addition of fall damage, swinging is much more engaging and also allows us to reach much higher speeds. When I'm playing Spider-Man 2, I'm finding myself diving a lot or falling, so I can swing out of it with heightened momentum. And while the game is very fun and the traversal is very fun, it also highlights a fundamental difference between this game and what I want Monster Hunter to be. The world is not the star of Spider-Man 2. Don't misunderstand me, the draw is being able to swing through what is probably the most realistic block-for-block recreation of NYC we've ever seen in a video game, but the city is not the star. The emphasis on movement and swing speed means you'll zip through those blocks in fractions of seconds. This map doesn't really have points of interest. It has pop-up crimes that can happen on what feels like any street corner and any rooftop. The game doesn't really have set pieces outside of its main story, because it's New York. It's just New York. And I don't blame Insomniac for doing this, they knew what game they were making, they didn't want to take away from the movement. But that's not Monster Hunter, so how do you balance the heightened movement that many players yearn for, and that we're likely getting, with the deliberate world design this series is known for? Well, let's talk about it. Now before I get into the series movement, I should get into something that's relevant to traversal in almost any game, that being the jump button shaped elephant in the room. The jump button. I'm talking about how Monster Hunter doesn't have a jump button. People who've played these games may think that's deceptive, so I'll explain what I mean. Monster Hunter doesn't have a manual jump button, but it's nothing without its contextual jumps. Running off of a ledge or a cliff will cause you to jump. Running into a ledge will cause you to vault over it, which is kinda like a jump. When you're climbing a surface, you can jump to make it go faster. In Rise and Sunbreak you can jump, but only when you're on your dog, and with the assistance of wire bugs, you can slingshot yourself into the air, which is nothing if not a command jump. There's plenty of other examples I haven't mentioned, but my point is there is no universal jump button that you can always use, unless it's, aerial style in GU. Your jumping is contextual. Obviously, this hasn't been a big deal in the past because these games are built around the lack of a jump button, but I do think it represents an aspect of Monster Hunter design that makes these games flow so well, and that's the cohesion of inputs, or some other, I don't know how else to say it, but let me explain what I mean. Going back to Spider-Man for a second, the game is always keeping track of whether you're in combat mode or traversal mode, or on the ground or in the air. There's things that you can do to forcibly swing in combat and vice versa, but generally there are some actions you aren't supposed to be able to take in certain contexts. For example, air tricks are performed in the game while swinging, and early on they're a great way to get some XP. However, this move is mapped to the same button as the swing kick, so sometimes if you're swinging right after ending combat and you try to do an air trick, you'll end up kicking the air instead until the game adjusts. You can actually tell if Spider-Man is in combat or relax mode based off the way he's standing, but all that kind of goes out the way once he's in the air swinging. In fairness, this is probably born out of necessity, as Spider-Man just has so many options and moves that they can't all be available at the same time. But Monster Hunter has never had this issue. As soon as you leave that camp, hell, as soon as you spawn on the map, you have all your actions available to you, and they do not change regardless of whether you're in traversal or in combat. You can argue that the controls do change once you go into combat and start using your weapon, but I argue it's a little different just because it's a change that you trigger intentionally as soon as you unsheath your weapon, as opposed to an involuntary switching of modes that is completely out of your control. What does this have to do with jumping? Well, if you recall, earlier I mentioned mounting. Ledges facilitate aerial attacks, which are the vehicle for mounting. But the best part is you have to be deliberate. You have to go out of your way to seek out different elevations for your aerial attacks to land properly. A command jump would probably lead to manual aerial attacks and brute force mounting. Now, this may not be the greatest concern for Capcom, especially since the Insect Glaive exists, the Clutch Claw and Glider Mantle already led to brute force mounting in Iceborne, and the aforementioned aerial style in GU pretty much was just a manual jump into attack to mount very easily. But something tells me that constant jumping attacks from all people, regardless of what weapon, regardless of what style they're using, would be just a little bit easier, just a little bit more brain dead. Regardless, my point is that a jump out of combat likely means a jump in combat if the series is to be trusted. Mounts can only be so mobile. It's probably why Palamutes have this weird stop and start kind of run, but I'll admit, half of what I just said is conjecture, so let's get back to what I do know. Ever since Monster Hunter ditched the loading screens, it's been moving in a direction that highlights verticality in its map designs. World's maps are super dense and large in a way I find overwhelming. I mean, I've been playing World for 6 years, and I swear I still find new stuff in the Ancient Forest every time I play. Just like its older siblings, World has plenty of these small, hidden away areas in its maps, but more importantly, it has a very solid range in the traversal, for what it's worth. Swinging on wedge beetles, swinging on vines, climbing on vines, swimming under stuff, pushing through tree roots, and falling through them. But just like a lot of other things in Monster Hunter, these are contextual. The traversal is made interesting because of what you're traversing through, not because of abilities that are inherent to your hunter. And this is a good thing. The hunter should be interacting with and moving through the environment in that way, because that's what a hunter does. But Rise took things in another direction. Most of these contextual movements either don't exist or don't matter, because they are easily overridden by wire bugs. In Rise, we can vault over mountains and run up cliffsides, let alone use the vines that are actually intended for climbing. Rise is an example of a game with greater traversal capabilities, kinda reflecting negatively on its exploration, because in every previous Monster Hunter game, you would kinda stumble upon things when going from point A to B. But the greater sense of verticality in Rise's maps means that some things are hidden in the highest peaks and the deepest valleys, where monsters can't even access. And with the amount of speed your Palamute allows you, it's more likely that you'll just beeline straight to the monster than it is that you'll find these hidden objects. The game does incentivize you to explore by spreading spearbirds throughout the map, which are very important if you want full health, stamina, and whatnot, but most players I know only explored at the very beginning, and once they had their optimized spearbird route, they didn't explore beyond that. And that's further exacerbated by the addition of skills like Spearbird's Call and Sunbreak, which make it so you don't even have to collect them to begin with. Rise has been out for 3 years at this point, and I have friends who don't know about the hidden scrolls in every map or the rare endemic life, and for the record, they don't have to. I don't blame them. The game is kinda scared of hiding away stuff that would be pivotal in any way. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that the wire bug facilitates much freer movement throughout the map, even if it isn't as well implemented as I wanted it to be. But no part of me thinks we're seeing wire bugs again, so no need to dwell on it for too long. Let's ask ourselves an important question: how is this gonna work? We're seeing Monster Hunter enter these larger spaces with mountains in the distance that we can seemingly traverse, so how will we traverse them? For the record, I don't know if Wilds is open world, no one knows that, but what we all know is that these zones are bigger than ever before, so it does make sense to think about open world traversal. Given the direction of the series so far, it wouldn't make sense to give us these open areas, but with the limited range of ways we can interact with them. That being said, it's been done before, for example in the Horizon games. If you're terminally online and you're on Twitter and you've seen the yellow paint debates, then you probably already know where I'm going with this. As much as I enjoy these games, it's always bugged me how you'll see a big mountain and then there's no way to get up it without using the little pop-out handholds that the game wants you to use, or the zip line that the game wants you to use, that very specific form of traversal. And similarly, if that were the case in Monster Hunter Wilds, it would still annoy me. Unlike a lot of these guys online, I'm not making this point because I'm annoyed by this notion of hand-holding. It's just that if I see a mountain, my expectation is that I'm going to be able to approach it from almost any angle. But yeah, when you think about it, it's the same as the vines and rock formations Capcom has been putting in these games since forever, just blended into the environment a little bit better. In any case, that stuff reads a lot better when it's in a game with condensed maps like Monster Hunter, and not something totally open world. Now from the trailer, it does look like this new mount has us covered in terms of interesting mobility and traversal, but whether it interacts with specific pop-outs like Aloy from Horizon, or if it lets us freely climb up mountains, remains to be seen. Now, while I don't want Spider-Man type movement in a Monster Hunter game, these wide open spaces do provide a necessity for not just quick movement, but engaging movement. Horses in Breath of the Wild are nice because they get you from point A to B much quicker, but as soon as Tears of the Kingdom allowed us to build insane contraptions, I almost never looked back. And I'm not saying that I should be able to build doohickeys in Monster Hunter, because that would just be Wild Hearts at that point, but I am saying traversal should be interesting. Monster Hunter has gotten around this in the past because their environments never necessitated very much travel, but as soon as we get open world or open zone, open world adjacent, this starts to become an issue. Naturally, as maps become larger, the same attention to detail can't be paid to every inch of the map, and there's bound to be stretches with little in them due to transitional purposes, among other things. Maybe they can give the mount a bunch of wild movement options but lock us out of using it in combat. I feel like that would mess with the seamless nature of Monster Hunter, so I wouldn't be in favor of it, but I'm just spitballing here, I don't know what they'll do. But what do you think? Am I crazy? Am I full of shit? Am I stupid? If that's what you think, you're mean. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. Or do. I don't care. Stay safe.